Hey everyone, Hellhog here, or you may know me as Aeyix on the Shadowlands, and I wanted to make an updated version of my 3.0 Innovative Ordnance Mercenary Guide. I'm also making a Republic side version for you Commando users. If you'd like the Assault Specialist version of this guide, you can find that, as well as Arsenal, Gunnery, Assassin, and Shadow guides in the description below, or on my YouTube channel. This guide will focus on the PvE side of IO, and is broken up into 6 parts. Timestamps to the separate parts can be found in the description below if you'd like to skip ahead. The 6 parts are IO's purpose and usefulness in flashpoints and operations, gearing overview, utilities overview, abilities overview, the rotation, and finally an example dummy parse. Let's get started. Overall, Innovative Ordnance in operations and flashpoints is a challenging yet rewarding discipline. It sits in the top tier of DPS disciplines, with the caveat that it takes slightly more focus to do well with. This extra layer of critical thinking for some players can make pulling off more difficult mechanics while executing the rotation properly difficult, thus falling into either a trap of overheating or taking avoidable damage. As great as the single target DPS is for IO, any fight with multiple periods of downtime or target switching will find themselves usually outpaced by Arsenal due to how close their potential DPS sits. Unfortunately, area of effect damage is practically impossible due to the heat constraints of the class. Although Death from Above is great ability and dot spreading is available, too much deviation from the rotation can be devastating to your heat management. It doesn't help that IO is the only discipline in the game that requires using 2 abilities to spread both dots. This alone makes dot spreading for IO difficult and generally not a recommended practice. Another challenge to IO is its instability with 4.0's gearing meta. When you start to push over 600 alacrity rating, timing of alacrity boosts from vent heat, supercharged gas, and supercharged celerity become extremely pertinent to properly maintaining your rotation. Mistiming the alacrity boost, which can be unpreventable if a merc pops supercharged celerity, can cause your rotation to outpace your internal cooldown for innovative particle accelerator, and not grant a buff to your mag shot, making you have to extend your rotation by 1 to 2 GCDs in order to fix the issue and fall back into rotation. If this occurs multiple times in a fight, your DPS for IO can fall to the equivalent, if not lower, than what Arsenal is capable of, negating the benefit of playing IO. Thankfully, IO maintains the same survivability as Arsenal, with the only difference being that Chaff Flare cooldown is for melee range attacks instead of force attack. Although IO can off-heal, concessions typically need to be made in the rotation to do so without overheating. With all this being said, IO is perfectly viable in all flashpoints and hard mode operations. IO is also great in nightmare operations. However, with Arsenal's better burst, target switching, and similar single target performance, it is much more favorable in many fights, and some progression raid groups may ask you to switch if it is better suited for the group's fight needs. Before you go any further with this guide, if you haven't done so yet, I highly recommend you go through and read all the tooltips and descriptions in your discipline and abilities pane so that you are familiar with the class, its buffs, abilities, and cooldowns. Now let's go over gearing. For those of you watching from my commando guides, don't mind the fact that I'm on a mercenary. Gearing for commandos and mercenaries is practically the same, and for the sake of simplicity and being able to show and discuss what I want, I'm on my mercenary since it's better geared. For those of you looking for more detailed information, discussion, and theory crafting around gearing, I highly recommend going to the SWTOR forums and checking out Ban's forum thread on gearing in 4.0. There's a lot of great information there, and if you have any questions, you can probably get them answered there. There'll be a link to that page in the video description below. So let's talk about the main difference between commandos and mercenaries, and that's the main hand offhand. Mercenaries will use dual blaster pistols, where the offhand blaster pistol deals significantly less damage than the main hand pistol, as well as having significantly less accuracy rating. Commandos, on the other hand, will use an assault cannon, which deals more damage than a blaster pistol in the main hand slot, and that's to make up for the lack of an offhand blaster pistol. In the offhand slot, a commando will use a generator to acquire tech power. As you note here on the left, the stat sheet for a commando, the primary damage is higher than that of a mercenary, but there is no secondary damage slot. One other key thing I want to go over that's the difference between disciplines and not so much classes is that Innovative Ordnance and Assault Specialist will have a different looking stat sheet than Arsenal and Commando. In Arsenal and Gunnery. You'll note here that the critical chance for ranged will go up by 5% in IOAS, while the alacrity will drop by 3% for IOAS, as you'll note now when I change stances. So I'll go ahead and show that again. So let's get started on the actual gearing aspect. In PvE, bosses have a 10% defense resist chance. So to counter that, we want to make sure we hit 110% tech and 110% ranged accuracy. This way we don't miss, and we increase our DPS significantly. And we do this two ways, by hitting 684 accuracy rating, as well as getting our companion buffs. If you go to your legacy pane, go to Global Unlocks under Imperial or Republic classes, you'll notice that completing conversation lines with companions grant buffs to your stats. The most important one being accuracy, which gives you a 1% increase in overall accuracy to all the tunes on your legacy. Other ones provide bonuses to crit chance, crit damage, healing received, and max health, and those are all very important to get. But the big one that I stress that you should get is accuracy. Now, you don't have to do it on a bounty hunter or on a trooper. Let's say you completed conversation lines with Lord Scourge for a Jedi Knight. That will grant the accuracy bonus to all the characters on your legacy. So that's important to get as it helps increase DPS further. Now, the way we get 684 accuracy rating is twofold. The first method is the method I like to use. And the reason I go with this method is A, because I was already doing this before proficient stems came around and I didn't want to change my gearing, and also because I PvE and PvP, and switching between the two it's easier to stick with the same stem. So in this method we use a versatile stem which grants mastery and power. And to get our accuracy we use 2 initiative enhancements, which are the best in slot accuracy enhancements available, and 5 accuracy augments. Alternatively, you can use a polybiotic proficient stem, which instead of mastery and power grants accuracy and crit rating. You will still use 2 initiative enhancements, but now instead of 5 you will only use 2 accuracy augments. Doing this in 220 and 224 gear will grant you the accuracy cap with the minimum amount of wasted stat. If you're in 216 gear, you'll be just under the accuracy cap, but that's not a big deal for the content you'll be playing in 216 gear. As a note, for Mercenary users, because your offhand is still under 110% accuracy, that extra accuracy stat is actually not wasted, like it is for Commandos and most other classes in the game. Now, going into set bonuses, for Commandos and Mercenaries, you want to make sure you use the Eliminator set bonus, as that's what grants bonuses to your damage, decreases cooldowns on one of your defensives, and gives you auto crits. Now, for actual individual gearing, once I've hit my accuracy cap, I personally like around 800 alacrity and 1300 critical rating for both IOAS and Arsenal Gunnery. From there, you can kind of play around with what works best for you and what you prefer, but this is what I've come to like and what works best for me. Now, you'll get accuracy enhancements when you turn in tokens in the glove slot, the feet slot, as well as the offhand slot. And one thing that you have the luxury for a bounty hunter is that there's also a heal class involved with bounty hunters and troopers. So since you only need 2 accuracy enhancements, once you get it in the hands and feet, you don't need to get it in the offhand as well. So get the healer offhand when you turn in an offhand token, which I believe is called the combat medic piece. So if you get that, you'll get a critical enhancement, and it just reduces the amount of min-maxing that you have to do. Now, the way I get the rest of my stats is you'll get only an alacrity enhancement through the headpiece. So if you want more alacrity, you need to do that through either the earpiece, implants, or you'll just have to rip from other sets that you turn in. Now, I use an alacrity in the headpiece, and then the rest are crit, with the exception of the 2 accuracy enhancements. And then for augments, outside the 5 accuracy augments I use, the rest of my augments are all alacrity. And this is what provides my alacrity and critical rating that you see here. I've tried power augments and I've tried mastery augments. I've tried less crit and more alacrity and vice versa, and I find that for IOAS and Arsenal Gunnery, this is what works best for me, and this is what provides the most DPS on boss fights and parsing. I would recommend trying to get at least 800 alacrity and 1300 crit once you've hit your accuracy cap, and then kind of play with it from there to see what works best for you. I don't recommend augmenting for mastery since we're hitting high diminishing returns with the crit chance you get from mastery. And instead, if you are going to do such a thing, augment toward power. However, the current meta and what I've found is that augmenting power does not provide as much DPS as augmenting for crit and alacrity does. So this is gearing for IOAS and Arsenal Gunnery in a nutshell. Choosing utilities for IO and PvE are fairly simple to do. For the most part, you'll use the same utilities across all fights. Jet Escape, for the most part, is very situational. It's mostly PvP, so we don't worry about it too much. Afterburners is very much PvP, so we won't worry about it. Custom Envirosuit is a very tiny survivability increase with increased health and healing received, so we'll take it since it's better than nothing. Gyroscopic Alignment Jets is sometimes worth taking. It's very situational. If there's a fight with a lot of knockbacks or immobilizations occurring, it's worth taking because it'll allow you to do your higher heat cost abilities, therefore more DPS. And if you are going to take it in place of Custom Envirosuit. Otherwise, we don't worry about it too much. Improved Vents is pretty much a must to take. The extra 15 vented heat is very important and very helpful to our rotation. Not to mention the 10% alacrity gain is a DPS increase. Power Barrier is a damage reduction increase based on doing our rotation, and so we take it since it is a survivability increase and makes the healer's job easier. Bore Sights is for increasing the DPS of sweeping blasters, and if you are going to be doing a lot of AoE in the fight where you feel like sweeping blasters will be necessary, I highly recommend playing Arsenal instead, because you just will not have the heat management available in IO to do this, so this is a pretty much unnecessary utility in IO. It's better off in Arsenal. And then lastly, in the skillful tier, we have adhesive supplements, which is PvP, so we don't worry about it. In the masterful tier, torque boosters isn't bad, however 6 seconds of hydraulic overrides is already a lot of time, so unless we absolutely need 10 seconds long of override, it's not worth taking. Pyro Shield is a nice utility to have. Whenever you take a lot of damage, if you pop Energy Shield, you'll dish damage back, so it is a DPS increase and nice to have. Infrared Sensors is PvP, so we won't worry about it. Suit FOE is basically having another cooldown. It's very situational. The only time it's worth taking is if there's a fight where there's a uncleansable dot or periodic effect on you that's dealing a significant amount of damage, so much so that it's difficult for the healers to maintain everyone alive. This will make the job easier for your healers while increasing your survivability. It's only worth taking in those situations, so it is a very situational utility. For the most part, I'll take Protective Field since it increases healing received while energy shields up, which is a nice survivability increase, makes your healer's job easier. Alternatively, instead of Protective Field, I'll take Power Shield, which will remove activation pushback, so if I'm taking a lot of damage, it's causing my power shot, my serrated shot to suffer pushback. I'll take this so I don't have to worry about the APM loss and thus the DPS loss. Heat damping is useless all around, so don't worry about it. Supercharged defense, although it seems nice, nothing's going to interrupt you, so you don't need the immunity. And 15% defense chance isn't really a lot in PvE, not to mention you're going to be popping supercharged gas as soon as you get 10 stacks, so you don't even get to choose when you use the defensive, so it's really not worth taking for that reason. Into the heroic tier now, Energy Rebounder is only worth taking if you're taking a lot of small trickle damage often, and there's 0 AoE damage in the fight. The small trickle damage will allow the energy redoubt to absorb more damage than if it was, let's say, occasional heavy hits. Then you won't see as much use from the energy redoubt. Not to mention the reduced cooldown energy shield only occurs if you're taking a lot of damage often. Power overrides isn't really necessary. Having 2 charges of power surge is nice, however, for the most part in IO, if you're not careful about how you use power surge, you can mess up your rotation. I do take in almost all fights stabilized armor. It has a 30% damage reduction from area of effect attacks, as well as while you're stunned. There are a few fights where it's not useful to take, and for those fights that's where I would take Energy Rebounder, but for the most part I take stabilized armor. Jet Rebounder is PvP, so we don't worry about it too much. Supercharged Reserves is pretty much useless. You can build 10 stacks of supercharged gas by just using Culto Shot, so we don't worry about doing it before a fight this way. We just keep casting up Culto Shot. Culto Jets is useless as a DPS, so we don't worry about it. Thrill the Hunt is probably the best utility we have. It allows us to use Unload on the move, which allows us to obey mechanics while maintaining DPS, which is huge. And then lastly, Smokescreen is pretty much PvP, so we're not going to worry about it too much. This is pretty much the utility setup I use for most fights, with the occasional switch up of Protective Field for Power Shield, and that's about it. The next thing to discuss is IO's offensive and defensive cooldowns. We have 3 main defensive cooldowns available to us, starting with Culto Overload. When used, will rapidly start to heal us up to 40% health, or upwards of 8 seconds. It can also be used above 40% health, but it will not trigger until below 40% health. Should it take a minute without triggering, or should we activate it and it go off, then it will go on cooldown for 3 minutes afterward. Another defensive cooldown we have is Energy Shield that when activated increases our damage reduction by 25% for 12 seconds. Any utilities associated with it, such as Pyro Shield, will also activate. Should we have the 4-piece set bonus available, it'll reduce the cooldown from 2 minutes to 1 minute 45 seconds. Our final main defensive cooldown available to us is Chaff Flare that when popped increases our defense chance by 35% for 6 seconds, as you can see here. Once that ends, it goes back to normal. Now, if for situational use you are spec'd into Suit FOE, using Cure on yourself increases your periodic damage reduction by 30% for 12 seconds. You can also use Cure on yourself or a friendly target to cleanse tech and physical effects, but it will not work against mental effects. So that covers all the defensive cooldowns. For offensive cooldowns, we have Supercharged Gas, which in Combustible Gas Cylinder increases dot damage by 10% and puts a dot on the target when you successfully use a ranged attack on the target. So as you see there, I've added a burning effect to the target just by using Mag Shot. We also have Thermal Sensor Override, which will make our next attack cost no heat. So if I pop that, then let's say pop Thermal Detonator, my heat doesn't rise at all. We also have Power Surge, which can be used to prevent a activation time on certain abilities. So under normal circumstances, Serrated Shot has to be activated and Power Shot has to be activated. But if we pop Power Surge, we can now use Serrated Shot on the move. However, Serrated Shot and Power Shot after that can no longer be used on the move, and you'll see it says cannot do that while moving. Also, if we find ourselves in heat trouble, we can use Vent Heat to immediately vent off a large amount of heat and get ourselves back into a favorable DPS situation. We also have 2 gap closers available to us, one of them being Hydraulic Overrides, which makes us immune to knockdown and other physics such as roots, while increasing our movement speed by 30% for 6 seconds. Alternatively, we also have Rocket Out, which can be used to move backwards very fast, or with some fancy camera work, can be used like a gap closer, as you can see there. Since we are a mixed heal DPS class, we do have off heals available to us, such as Culto Shot, which I can use on myself or somebody else since it's a free heal. There's also Emergency Scan, which can be used on the move. And then finally Rapid Scan, which has to be activated. However, if you have a Speed to Burn proc available, you can use it instantly while moving. We also have 2 raid utilities available to us, one of them being Supercharged Celerity that when popped, gives the entire raid group 10% increased alacrity for 10 seconds, and then goes on cooldown for the remainder of the group for 5 minutes. We also have Onboard AED, also known as a Battle Res, which will allow us to revive somebody that's gone down in the middle of combat, and can be useful to revive them ourselves instead of having to have a healer stop healing to do so. So that covers all the offensive and defensive cooldowns available to IO. Before we finally get into an example parse for Innovative Ordnance, I want to briefly go over the rotation. You can pause the video here to read this if you'd like. I'll also include a link in the description so you can download this. The IO rotation may seem daunting at first, but it really is quite simple once you familiarize yourself with it. It's only 10 GCDs long, and so easy that it can actually be macroed. The most challenging part of it is just mastering it, however that's true of any discipline. To start, we want to make sure we're in Combustible Gas Cylinder for our stance. With our opener, we'll precast Serrated Shot, followed by Incendiary Missile or other dot, and then we follow an order of abilities that proc perfectly and allow us to do max potential DPS in our opener, while flowing perfectly into our rotation. The rotation itself is 10 GCDs long, or 9 abilities, and it's mostly static with the exception of the 4th and 10th GCD, where we follow 2 separate priorities. For the first priority, we want to try and use Electronet if it's off cooldown. Otherwise, if we have the heat to spare, we'll use Thermal Detonator, and if not, we'll mostly use Rapid Shot. If we're in the execution phase, where the boss is below 30% health, if Missile Blast procs, and we have enough heat available for Missile Blast but not for Thermal Detonator, then we'll use Missile Blast instead. For the second priority, we'll mostly use Rapid Shot with the exception of if we're entering or in heat ramping. We'll use Power Shot with the exception of if we're in the execution phase and it procs, then we'll use Missile Blast instead since it deals more damage than Power Shot. Even if we have the heat to spare for Power Shot in the second priority, we typically prefer to Rapid Shot if we're not in heat ramping, as this will allow us to do more Thermal Detonators, and Thermal Detonator does more damage than Power Shot. Below you can see an example rotation, where we assume that after pass 11, we're in the sub 30% phase for the boss. These shaded regions are what we call heat ramping, and heat ramping is a more advanced rotation where you purposely put yourself into heat trouble. However, you make specific use of thermal sensor override and vent heat to allow yourself to use more damaging yet more heat exhaustive abilities to do more DPS and to prevent yourself from getting into heat trouble. The downside of doing this advanced rotation, called heat ramping, is that should you find yourself into heat trouble later in a fight, you will not have these cooldowns available to you to rescue yourself, and you'll have to instead just keep rapid shotting until you're out of that heat issue. Some notes about the rotation is that if you follow the rotation it's been long enough for speed to burn to come off internal cooldown, then it's best to just start with the opener as it will flow perfectly back into the rotation. Be careful where you use Power Surge for an instant ability instead of having to cast. It's best to pretty much only use on Serrated Shot or on the 10th GCD assuming you're using Power Shot. If you use it on GCD 9, you'll mess up the proc timing of IPA. The reason being is IPA is proccing at the end of the GCD here, and if you use Power Surge, then Power Shot occurs at the beginning of the GCD, and thus it's only been 6 seconds and IPA hasn't come off internal cooldown yet. To fix that, should you make this mistake, you'll have to Power Shot again in the 10th GCD and then add an 11th GCD where you Rapid Shot to fix that. If the rotation timing messes up at all, and you find yourself using Speed to Burn on Serrated Shot instead of Power Shot in GCD 5, the best way to fix that is to just swap GCDs 9 and 10, where GCD 9 is where you will do a Power Shot and procs IPA, while GCD 10 you'll follow the priority. And the reason for this is Power Shot is proccing IPA at the end of the GCD here, at the beginning of the GCD, but if you're using Speed to Burn on Serrated Shot instead of Power Shot, then you're no longer proccing at the beginning and you're proccing at the end of the GCD, which means you have to delay this proc a second and a half as well, which is why it fits perfectly into GCD 10 instead. Lastly, this rotation is highly volatile with alacrity rating in 4.0 being so high. If you have higher than 600 alacrity, there's always the risk that certain alacrity boosting cooldowns like Vent Heat, Supercharged Gas, and Supercharged Celerity can mess up the timing of your internal cooldowns. When this happens, and it most commonly occurs in GCD 5 or GCD 9, the best thing to do is to add an extra Power Shot to proc IPA, and then if necessary you add a Rapid Shot to not mess up timings. So if it's GCD 5, you just need to add a Power Shot, although you can add a Rapid Shot if you need to for the heat purposes. And for here at GCD 9, should it not proc IPA and you have to proc it at GCD 10, then you absolutely must add an 11th GCD where you Rapid Shot so that the timing doesn't mess up at all. For AoE, we pretty much don't try to AoE in IO at all. You do not have the heat management available to do it. It's not very favorable, and it's better to do Arsenal if you need to do AoE. However, should you need to do minor AoE at all, Explosive Dart and Fusion Missile will spread your Serrated Shot and Incendiary Missile dots. After that, you can also do Death from Above and Sweeping Blasters. However, if you've done all 4 of these in succession, probably chances are you've overheated. And if that's the case, you're better off not doing the heat ramping rotation and saving Thermal Sensor Override and Vent Heat for those portions of AoE. And that's pretty much the IO rotation in a nutshell. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, unless you skipped ahead of course, and that's the example Innovative Ordnance dummy parse. Before I get started, some quick things to go over. So on the bottom left here I'll have a keyboard showing the keystrokes I'm using. On the top right, I'll have Star Parse showing stats for the parse, and the SWTOR caster showing the abilities I'm using. If you'd like to see more details on the parse, there'll be a link in the description below. Real quick, I just want to flash my character sheet again. Even though I put it earlier in the video, it's just a quick refresher. Before we do any type of parsing, we want to make sure we apply an armor reduction module to the dummy, as well as a health modulator. Currently, the accepted amount is about 1.5 million health. However, for the sake of this video, I'm going to use a million just for time purposes. Before we pull any boss or do any type of dummy parsing, we want to make sure we build up 10 stacks of supercharge, and we do that by using Culto Shot. Do note though, Culto Shot can proc your relics, so it's best to have that done early so your relics can go off of cooldown and be able to use again immediately. So in a few seconds that'll be good to do. Alright, we can start our rotation, so let's get started. Now we're going right into heat ramping right out of the opener. You notice our energy is in a good enough spot, pardon me, our heat, that we can use the thermal detonator without any issues about heat. Again, we can use another thermal detonator safely. However, we don't have the heat available, so we will not use another thermal detonator. We'll just rapid shot instead. Now you'll notice Electronet has come off cooldown, so we'll be using Electronet here. Also, we're approaching execution phase on the boss, and we're going back into heat ramping again. We can safely thermal detonator here. You notice as the boss gets low on health, we want to be wary about what dots we reapply. I'm actually going to use Power Surge to get serrated shot off quicker, and start just spamming other abilities that do high damage, as going through the normal rotation will actually be a DPS loss. And there you have it. That's an example of innovative Ordnance Mercenary Parse. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this guide to be helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them in the comments section below and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. Feel free to share this video, and as always, good hunting out there.